Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Infants, Toddlers, and the Class Measure, Developmentally Appropriate Practices. This is the latest installment in our 2013 webinar series, The Class System, Practical Strategies for Improving Learning, which you can check out on our website. Go to www.teachstone.com, click the Class tool, then click Webinar Series on the left sidebar. During our time together today, our presenter, Rebecca Berlin, will introduce the new infant class measure, its structure, and how it compares and contrasts with the toddler class measure. My name is Keely Breeden, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. The webinar will run for about an hour. We will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end of today's session, but if you have any questions at any point during the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A box to chat with us. We'll also be tweeting during the webinar using the hashtags infant and toddler. You can join the conversation using the Twitter feature in the webinar console. Today's session is being recorded and it will be available on our website as a free resource. Once the recording is posted on our website, we'll send a link to everyone who registered for this webinar, letting them know that it's ready to view. Finally, at the end of our time today, we ask that you take a few minutes to complete our brief 6-question event survey. Your answers will help us to improve future events. You can find the survey in the webinar console at the bottom of your screen by clicking the red survey button on the far right. Next, I'd like to give you all a little bit of information about Teachstone. Teachstone provides educators with the knowledge, tools, and skills proven to improve student learning and development by focusing on the effectiveness of teacher-child interactions. Teachstone works at the intersection of research and practice, enabling teachers to maximize the impacts of their moment-to-moment interactions with students. Our evidence-based offerings range across the age levels from birth through grade 12, and they empower educators to learn about, measure, and improve teacher-student interactions. Since interactions are at the core of what we do, we hope that this webinar will be one of many interactions you'll have with us. As I mentioned, today's webinar is the latest installment in our 2013 series. We'll have one more webinar in December to close out the year, which will focus on using class data to provide effective feedback. You can get more information and register for this event by visiting our website at www.teachstone.com. Also, please keep in mind that we post all of our webinar recordings online as a free resource. We hope you'll stay in touch with us by following us on Facebook and Twitter. Remember, we'll be live tweeting during today's presentation with the hashtags infant and toddler. Finally, you can always connect with us by calling our customer support number at 1-866-998-8352. Now, before I hand it over to Rebecca, we have 3 quick poll questions. First, we want to know a little bit more about you. Tell us what it is you do. Please choose the option that is closest to what you do for the majority of your day. We want to make sure that the information we provide you today suits your needs. Once we know a bit more about you, we can tailor our later discussion accordingly. We've had a wide range of folks join these webinars in the past, so it's always interesting to see who's on the line. We'll be closing the poll in just a few seconds. All right. It looks like we have a good number of education coordinators, some teachers, lots of administrators, coaches, and technical assistants on the line today. That's great. Thank you. Our second poll question is about your familiarity with the class tool. Tell us how much experience you have with the class system. Do you know only a little bit about the class? Have you used it on occasion but perhaps aren't an expert? Or do you use the class frequently and feel comfortable with the associated language? The class knowledge varies among participants on these webinars, and we want to be sure to cater to your depth of understanding. Great. It looks like we have quite a variety here today. Lots of you have used the class measure regularly. That's great. All right. And finally, what information are you hoping to gain from this webinar today? Please select any or all of the options. Are you looking for an overview of the infant and toddler class measures? Maybe some information about related training and professional development that we will offer? Or do you want support for integrating the infant and toddler measures at your local or state scale? All right, well, we'll provide all of this information for you all today, so we look forward to getting to that. Now that we know a little bit more about you, let's get to know our presenter for today. Rebecca Bruin earned her BA in English in American Government at Georgetown University, her MA in Infant and Early Childhood Special Education at George Washington University, and her PhD in Research, Policy, and Administration at the University of Virginia. Rebecca has worked in public and private schools as an early interventionist, an early childhood teacher, an early childhood special education teacher, an autism specialist, and a school administrator. Rebecca has also worked in higher education at the University of Virginia as the program coordinator for Early Childhood Special Education Teacher Preparation Program in the Curry School of Education, and as a co-investigator on an Institutes of Education Science grant at the Center for Advanced Study of Teaching and Learning. Rebecca has worked as the Vice President for Implementation at an organization focused on creating and delivering online professional development for pre-service and in-service teachers. As Chief Strategy Officer, Rebecca works with states and school districts to implement the class system and sets Teachstone's strategic direction. It's always a pleasure to have Rebecca with us, so without further ado, I will give her the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's always difficult to hear all the things that you've done throughout your life, and I like to summarize my accomplishments by just saying I've worn many hats, and so I've even either stood in the shoes or sat in the chairs that many of you have sat in right now. And so as I present on these webinars, and for those of you who have seen me present at conferences and in state meetings, what I like to think is that the many hats that I've worn help me see the different perspectives that are out there, so I'm able to think about implementation both from a teacher perspective, from a parent perspective, as well as how it feeds into a higher education system, a state system, and then a local implementation from the education coordinator to the coach. And so as we roll out programs as Teachstone, in my role as the Chief Strategy Officer, that's one of the things I help our organization do, is to try to think about these new products and new implementations from a multitude of perspectives. And so as a way to kind of lay out our time together today, the 4 questions I'm going to try to answer are really first, what is the research behind effective teacher-child interactions? Then second, what are the domains and dimensions of the infant and toddler measures? And then we're going to take a few minutes, and this is what anyone who works with technology, I always cross my fingers when I do video on webinars and presentations. We're going to see what a dimension looks like in a real-life classroom, both from an infant perspective and then from a toddler's perspective. And then in the end, we'll talk a little bit about the resources that either are available as we talk about toddler or that will be available to support the class framework. So we're going to start talking about the importance of interactions. I think it's important to think about the context that these tools, both the toddler tool and the infant tool, have developed out of. And that really is the basis of teacher-child interactions. And I like to start with this slide with the smiling faces from the child and the caregiver, and with the heading, Interactions Matter. And for anyone who's been on our website recently, about a month ago, we released a new video that I believe is entitled Interactions Matter. And it really shows, both visually as well as Dr. Pianta, Dr. Hamry, and myself talk about those interactions, as well as talk about them with some teachers who are using the class. And I think, especially as we really get into the nitty-gritty about implementation, sometimes you forget about the kids, the people that are on the other side. So it's important to think about why those interactions are there. And what we know, no matter if it's a 6-week-old, if it's a 6-year-old, if it's a 16-year-old, or for those of us who are, in that 36 to 56 range, interactions matter for everyone. And they really are the foundation of children's learning and development. And then what we found now is that over these years of research, we really have learned a lot about outcomes and the fact that teacher-child interactions really drive those outcomes. This is a quote from an article that was published in the journal Science in August of 2013. There's a blog post available on our website that talks about and gives a summary of this. And actually in January of 2014, we'll have the lead author, Terry Sobel, do a presentation through a free webinar on it. But what the research found is that of the 5 individual quality indicators that it looked at through QRIS systems, that the class measure of teacher-child interactions was the most consistent in predicting children's learning. You'll often hear Dr. Pianta and others at Teachstone say, that which we measure is important. And I think that's one of the things to think about as we think about structuring these systems, either a QRIS system or a local, how am I going to look at my teachers and improve my family child care setting. I think it's important to really think about what drives outcomes. And so that could be outcomes in kindergarten as well as outcomes K through 3. And so we need to think about when we have a small amount of resources, a small amount of energy to spend in professional development dollars to spend, what should we support teachers in and what should we coach teachers in? And one of the things that it continues to come out in the research is the fact that teacher-child interactions matter. And just for the point of this conversation, as well as it will come out in the infant manual as well, is we are using the word teacher. And by that word teacher, we mean family child care teacher, child care teacher, private preschool teacher. We have kind of spent a lot of time looking into that and have at one point have been using the term child care provider, but for consistency across our measures, we really are focusing on that word teacher. But I mean that to be a very inclusive term. So for the first part of this webinar, I'm going to talk just briefly about this intersection of research and policy and how it really leads to support early childhood programs. Those of you who have seen me present often will see me talk with my hands a lot, and poor Keely sitting next to me is a little afraid that I'm going to start talking with my hands during these presentations. But what I often will do is show a semicircle with my hands, and on one side of the semicircle I will say, this is what research and best practice shows, and this is the real life that our programs live in. And that's why I think it's important to kind of talk about at the beginning that I have worn many hats. So I understand both sides of it, and that's where I think the context of early childhood programs over the last 30 years have come out of. How do we marry what we're learning in research and best practice to what's happening in the real world? And so kind of just to spend a minute historically, in the 1980s up through the early 2000s, we were continuing to have a debate over what was a quality early childhood program. In the 60s and 70s, things like the Perry Preschool Project and the Chicago Child Parent Project showed that intensive intervention could lead to outcomes. But there was concern about fade out, as well as how do we scale those programs. As I talked about, does research and best practice, how can that move things into the large child care setting or a large QRIS setting? And what we really looked at is what was going on inside of those classrooms. And so some of the foundations of this was an attachment theory. Really the foundation of class goes back to attachment theory, if you think about it, because who are our children's first teachers? Their first teachers are their parents or their grandparents, those people who are raising them from the first moments of life. And I think some of the questions in early childhood programs were, could a caregiver provide those strong attachments? And so some of that early research really looked at that. What are we quote quote doing in early childhood programs, especially those programs that are birth to 3? What are we teaching kids? And the teaching that was really going on was that interaction, because what children were learning, or what children continue to learn, are based on attachment theory. If kids have good attachment with their care providers, and that could be a single provider or multiple providers, they will learn better. We all kind of think about those kids and how that connection occurs. I'm looking at this picture on the slide, and you can almost see the child looking into her caregiver's eyes. And there's that connection, there's that attachment, which I think is so important. And the other thing that we really were looking to during that time were other theorists. And so Bronfenbetter really talked a lot about the ecological systems theory. And it's kind of, as you look at this diagram, all of the components that are intersecting on the child at the center. And one of those pieces really is that school, in the earliest school, being either a private provider or a family child provider, and how that school was impacting that child's life. And then kind of adding attachment theory to ecological theory to some of the research that came out at that time. And there was a pivotal study that came out in 2000 from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And one of the initial authors, Bob Pianta, of the class, was a part of that study. And it really looked at the multiple aspects of children's environments for the first time on a larger scale, and was looking at both the teacher-child interactions as well as the parent-child interactions and the classroom environments. And what it found is that, based on strong interactions, we could have a broad range of outcomes, both positive social and behavioral, as well as cognitive and academic, as well as self-regulation. And it was really the first time that we were able to show on a large scale that quality child care was linked to child outcomes. And really at that point we began to define quality as effective teacher-child interactions. And then out of that study, the foundations of the class were developed. And for those of you who have seen me present before, I often like to use pictures and quotes to kind of focus and refocus us during our conversation. So I wanted to include this about the importance of relationships as we move along to infant. And so what the quote says is, young children experience the world in a context of relationships. In turn, these relationships influence all areas of development. These relationships also lay the foundation for later developmental outcomes, including self-confidence, mental health, motivation to learn, achievement in school, and conflict resolution. And as I think about those developmental outcomes, both from the academic side, but I also think about it as a mother of a middle school child who really wants a child who's self-confident, who wants a child who can effectively work through conflicts, and as well as wants a child who is achieving well in school. But it really is for parents out there, as well as what we know from serving early elementary teachers, that they really want children who come to the classroom ready to learn, but ready to learn is more than just those ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It really is that they have the confidence and they have the motivation to learn. And what we know is that by having quality teacher-child interactions early on, we are building those foundations, because from the beginning we are teaching kids to trust adults in their environment and to take risks in expanding their knowledge. The other piece, so I'm going to kind of take attachment, ecological theory, and the research that came out. And what we found was that there were multiple levels of quality. And the structural pieces of quality are important, no matter if it's an infant room or a toddler room or pre-K or a middle school room. But those are those who, what, where, and why. That's the curriculum and the standards and the materials. And those are important for quality, but what we found in those early studies in 2000 was that it's the process piece. And that was the first time we really scientifically looked at that process piece, and that's the how piece. And that's how these curricula, how these standards, how these materials are implemented. And what we found is that through the interactions, that's when we saw improved outcomes. Because I always liken to the fact, and I actually presented with my colleague Amy Savka recently, and what she actually gave the audience a question, and she said, would you rather have 100 books and a teacher who, what kind of was okay and could read the book to the child but not push them to the next step? Or would you rather have a classroom with 2 books, but a teacher who could take those 2 books and use them in so many ways and connect with those children in so many ways? And I think that's what this comes down to. We need some of those structural pieces. Those are important. The licensing piece, those basic health and safety are absolutely important. But at the higher level, once you have those in place, it is the interaction piece, the process piece that really takes you to the next level. And now at the center of this, the center of the circle, you see effective teacher-child interactions. And so now I'm going to kind of transition and begin talking about the class. And as many people think about the class, they think about that yellow section, that measure section. But one of the things we're really focusing on at Teachstone this year is this idea that it's not that the measure is important, but it is the full system. So it's thinking about how are teachers going to learn about effective teacher interactions. And then how are we going to work with them to improve those? So as we go through this piece, that's one of the things I want you to keep in mind. It's not just about how we're measuring teachers. And that in measurement of programs is important to see where we are starting and how to provide feedback and how to move them on. But the other pieces, there is a full circle there. And so we have to think about in any implementation, for the people on the phone who are part of state implementations or large headstand grantees, of how are you going to teach the teachers and the program directors about these important features of teacher-child interactions. And then once you have that measurement piece, how are you going to use it to improve outcomes? So in summary, really thinking about how moving from a world where kind of early childhood education was in a way a black box, we didn't know what the components were that were driving outcomes at the end, to a time we still have a lot to learn, don't get me wrong, but I think we are coming closer to seeing what are those things that we should focus on. And so we are at a critical time right now where we're seeing the research and theory intersecting with policy. And kind of that's where this research and best practice comes to the real world and looking at how it's going to affect early childhood programs. And as we think about it, we've spent a lot of time in the last 10 years focusing on 3- and 4-year-olds. But I had the opportunity in a conference in Arizona, First Things First, I apologize, in Arizona, and Peter Maglione from West Ed was speaking, and he really brought home to me this idea that it is very important to continue our push for 3- and 4-year-old quality programs, but really we have got to, at the same time, begin to put efforts into birth to 3, because as we know, brain development starts in utero, and so as soon as those children enter either a family home, for local care, or a structured setting, it is important to really to drive quality. And that doesn't mean beginning to teach 1- and 2-year-olds ABCs and 1-2 things. What quality means in those early years, which is what we'll talk about in a second, is it really means very strong interactions so that they can learn about the environment that they're spending time in. So we're going to begin talking about the infant tool. And so as you think about Teachstone, many of you probably know about the pre-K class. But at this point, once infant is released in April of 2014, we will actually have tools across the entire spectrum, from infant through secondary. And all of them, although the domains are a little bit different, and I'll talk about that in a second, they are all focused, number one, on effective teacher-child interactions, but they all focus on these 3 issues: having warm, sensitive, individualized interactions, having interactions that are predictive, proactive, and engaging, and having interactions that are stimulating, language-rich, and responsive. And so this will kind of set the stage, and we'll go in depth in this in a second. But what this does is this lays out the class dimensions across the ages from infant to K3. And what you'll see is as we start out with infant with 4 dimensions, we move to 9 in toddler, and then expand to 10 in pre-K and K3. And then as we move up through the ages, we see more similarities with pre-K and K3 in upper elementary and secondary. And so infant, I love this picture. You know, seeing this little boy really engaged in those blocks. And so as we think about infant, we think about the idea that infants learn about the world through their interactions with their primary relationships. And so those earlier relationships are initially established with their parent, or if they're in a primary care environment, with their child care provider. And what we know through research is that there was a question in the 60s and 70s, right? That, you know, could children have a strong relationship? You know, were children who were in outside care, were they behind? Would they fall behind? Could they thrive as much as children who were staying at home with a primary care provider? And that's difficult for people like me who are working moms and working dads out there who are on the phone. Is, you know, you really want to make sure your child has that strong relationship. And so what we know from that research, from that study I mentioned a little bit ago, is that can happen. But what needs to happen is we need to have those same quality interactions that can happen with parents with their primary care provider. And when I think about the interactions that infants have, as we talk about this is one of the things that is definitely different between infants and toddlers and pre-K children, is those interactions look different. And as the authors developed out the suite of the class tools, that's one of the things I really wanted to highlight, is that while there's some similarities, how those interactions kind of look and how we interact with children is distinctly different. And for children at this infant age, I think about this dance of interaction. This idea that, you know, a child is engaging with blocks, but but they look at the blocks, and then they look at the caregiver or their parent, and they look back at the blocks, and then so they're learning about the things in their environment through those interactions. And so this is a first look at the structure of the infant class measure. And so the infant class measure will be released in April of 2014, and it can be used in classrooms serving children from 6 weeks till 18 months old. And what we say, and I can talk about this a little bit later, is that the suggestion is to use the tool that represents the majority of the children in the classroom. And at the end, I have a couple questions for you to think about and to provide us feedback on how because across the country, one of the things we know is that care looks different, and children are grouped in different ways. So the infant tool can be used with children 6 weeks to 18 months. And so what we find is that, you'll notice this is different from those of you who are familiar with pre-K, is there's one domain that we think about as we call responsive caregiving, and then there are 4 dimensions: relational climate, teacher sensitivity, facilitated exploration, and early learning support. And when we look at those dimensions, we think that those are the best way to describe infant classrooms. They're tied together in one unified developmental way, and that way is this concept of responsive caregiving. And then as children progress developmentally through toddlers, we're going to see that the domains split into 2, and then as they move into pre-K, splitting into 3 domains as children's development becomes more sophisticated. And so I'm going to take a few minutes just to describe each of these dimensions for you. So relational climate really reflects the connections, the emotions, and the respect conveyed by teachers, as well as the infant's responses to those interactions. And for those of us who have spent time with either the pre-K or one of the other classes, you can't help to try to make connections to those other dimensions and other age levels. And I'll try to do that, but I think it's important to picture these as different. So relational climate looks a little bit like positive climate, that idea of respect and connection. And then we have the same structure that there's the dimension and then there's the indicator. And so the indicators under relational climate are relational behaviors. So those behaviors that reflect the consistency of positive behavior, physical closeness, sharing attention, and the degree of affection shown toward the infants. And then the next indicator under relational climate is emotional expression. So really capturing the smiling and laughing of the teachers, as well as the general happiness and playfulness of the children. So again, those of you familiar with pre-K, hear some of those positive climate language coming out. This, as a former special educator, this is one of my favorite indicators from the infant class. It's respect for the infant state. So it encompasses the degree to which teachers' interactions with infants are calm, gentle, and respectful and informative. So the idea that instead of acting on a child, explaining what is happening. So talking about not just changing a diaper, but talking about, I'm coming over and I'm going to pick you up. So really using that as a teachable moment, as well as a way to show respect, that I'm not going to act on a child without explaining to him or her what's going to happen. And then the last indicator is the lack of adult negativity. So unlike toddler and pre-K, this doesn't stand alone as a dimension. It really is so closely related to this relational climate but it is still this idea that it reflects the absence of negativity, irritability, and frustration or rough behavior with children. Oops, sorry, I'm staying here. This is a long one. The next one is teacher sensitivity, and again, this is one of the dimensions that actually is consistent across all of the class measures, and it encompasses the teacher's awareness and responsiveness to the infants, both verbal as well as their nonverbal cues, as well as how they're providing comfort, how they are skilled in resolving distress, as well as the timeliness and the contingency of the responses. And then the indicators under that are awareness and cue detection. So are teachers aware of those cues that infants are giving? Their responsiveness, so how are they responding to children's individual needs? And then infants' comfort. What is the general level of contentment and the degree to which the infants seek out the teachers if they're upset or unhappy? And we know from reviewing so much video is that there can be uncomfortableness or distress in infant classrooms. That's part of infant development. Infants talk to adults by crying initially to show their distress or their need. But what the class is really looking at is, are the infants really looking out for the teachers when they are distressed, and are they comforted by that? Then facilitated exploration, which I would say is a little bit of concept development in ILF, and it really considers the teacher's facilitation of experiences and interactions with both routine care and playtime. And so it's important to remember that as we're looking at the infant class, we are looking across that whole day. And so what we know is that so much learning, in fact, the majority of the learning happens during those routine diaper changings, those routine washing the children's faces, routine feeding. And so how are those interactions happening? It's not just the playtime that's learning. And so we look at to see if the teachers are actively involved, if the activities are infant-centered, as well as are the teachers expanding the infant's experience. So if a child is rolling a ball, what is the teacher doing to expand that rolling? And then the last dimension, which we'll spend a little bit more time talking about as we watch video, is the early language support. And this kind of on toddler would map to language modeling and quality of feedback. But it really captures the amount and the quality of the teacher's use of language. And are they using language stimulation as well as language facilitation techniques to encourage the early language development? So what amount of teacher talk is there? What amount of communication support is there? Are the teachers both initiating as well as repeating the sounds from children? And then what communication extension are they doing? And I think this is a difference between the class and other tools, is it's not just talking about the quantity of language that's in the environment, but really is the quality, and are they expanding the children's the language cues. So those are the so remember there's the one domain and then the 4 dimensions. And so this is just a summary of some of the initial data from the pilot. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the development. So in 2010 and 2011, the University of Virginia did a pilot of the class with classrooms in the Mid-Atlantic in infant classrooms. And then Teachstone in September, from September 2012 to just this past June, we worked with pilot sites, and thank you if any of the pilot sites are on this call, in Virginia, in Boston, in North Carolina, in Washington State, in Australia, some educator places across the country, as well as in Miami-Dade and Florida. And so those 7 organizations had the opportunity to pilot the class infant for a year. So they were all trained to reliability, and then they used it within either a research study or within a local program. And so some of the numbers that we kind of initial ranges for some of the domains. So as you see from the numbers on this slide are from the Virginia pilot, and so ranges in the mid for across the board. And then in our pilot sites, we saw similar distributions. So in our pilot sites, the range for Relational Climate was from a 4.11 to a 5.99. And then pretty similar for Teacher Sensitivity, a 4.09 to a 5.71. And then for Facilitated Exploration, a little lower than the pilot site, a 3.38 to a 4.27. And then Early Language Support, a 3.32 to a 3.97. And then similarly with the other class tools as they rolled out, as well as the scores that we're seeing right now, is we definitely see substantial variability across dimensions. So as we are out in programs, we see classrooms ranging anywhere from a 1 to a 6. And one of the things that kind of looking at the data, we still feel that this one domain really best describes the interaction. And then the other piece that happened is we were collecting ITER scores, both in the pilot and then a number of the pilot sites for Teachstone were also collecting ITER scores. And we saw both convergence and divergence as we expected. So we found convergence with the process and ITER's process language and talking, as well as the interaction kind of dimension within the ITERs. And then we found that it was divergent with the ITER structure. And what we are estimating is that the observation training and the manual, which will be produced by Brooks, will be available in April of 2014, and then when we will have professional development available in 2015. And then we have our infant who's grown up a little bit to a smiling toddler. I love her pursed lips. And so Toddler was released. So Toddler followed a similar kind of development at UVA and then field tested it at Teachstone. And Toddler was in final release and was released in a final version in March of 2012. And the final release of Toddler has 2 domains. So emotional and behavioral support and engaged support for learning. Anyone who is trained initially in Toddler in either 2010 or 2011 on a field test version, was trained with 3 domains, which actually mirrored identically to the pre-K tool. So emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. And as we began to look at data, and as the UVA began to look at data coming out of studies using the class tool, we found that really a 2-domain structure better represented development at the toddler level and what classrooms look like at the toddler level than a 3-domain tool. And so emotional support and classroom organization were merged to make the emotional and behavioral support domain. And then engaged support for learning was really just a renaming of instructional support. We felt that better, in a more developmentally appropriate way, described what was happening in toddler classrooms. And so this graphic provides an overview for those dimensions under those 2 domains. So positive climate, negative climate, teacher sensitivity, regard for child perspectives, and then behavior guidance is what merged into that first dimension. And then the 3 dimensions under engaged support for learning. So quality of feedback and language modeling, similar words for those of you who are familiar with pre-K, and then facilitation of learning and development really looks to me like a combination, when I think about it, of concept development and instructional learning formats. And so when we think about kind of the domains, those first 5 domains of emotional and behavioral support, we really focus on the emotional environment of the classroom, so how teachers are developing positive relationships, how they are helping children find an enjoyment in learning, and then and how children feel comfortable in the classroom. I mean, that's really a time where, toddler time, when you think about toddlers, that's a time where they want to be independent, they want to take risks, but they also have their leanings to a zone of comfort. So really understanding and looking at those classrooms to see how children experience appropriate levels of independence, and then are they using teachers as those positive, I call them beacons. Are they using them for comfort when they need it? And then when we think about engaged support for learning, we really think about how teachers help children problem solve and really think creatively, what kind of individualized feedback they're providing to children, and then on the language front, how they're helping children develop more complex language. And then as we think about scores on the toddler, and I know for those of you who are on from state systems, this is one of the things I do kind of in my Chief Strategy Officer hat is I do a learning community for state organizations who are using the class or thinking about using the class in QRS systems. And so this is kind of this next generation question that people are starting to consider. Most places have rolled out a pre-K, if they're using class or not, version of their QRS, and then they're doing a staggered rollout to then include to first include toddlers and then include infants. And so the kind of next generation questions we're beginning to get are, as they have locally set benchmarks for their QRS systems, what should those benchmarks look like moving forward for toddlers and then for infants? So what this chart is just showing is some of the data that came for the blue bars from publicly funded centers that were part of one of the pilots, and the data looking at those classrooms. What we're seeing is a little over an average score of a 5 in a mid-range for emotional and behavioral support, and then engaged support for learning really at the 3.5 level. And then I'm going to show you some additional data, I believe, on the next slide, which is breaking down some of the pilot data into dimension-level scores. And as we've said with pre-K, and as I said with infant, we are seeing variability within a dimension and across the dimensions. And if you kind of take a step back and you think about this, this does follow a similar pattern that we do see with pre-K, where positive climate is being a slightly higher, but still in the mid-range, and then teacher sensitivity and regard a little bit lower, and then engaged support for learning it really being in that 3, that low or kind of a mid-low score. But really we are seeing these classrooms that provide a variety of ranges. Classrooms at a 1 range to a 7. Now, as with pre-K, the language piece, that instructional support piece, does continue to be difficult for teachers, and really those are sitting in the low to the mid level. What we're going to do now is we're going to spend a few minutes, as I always joke when I present, crossing my fingers, and we're going to play some video for you. And this is difficult because in a professional development setting or even a presentation setting, we would be able to have some back and forth talking about this, but because of the 400 people talking at once probably isn't the best way to do a webinar. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail, about those 2 language dimensions. And so one of the things we do is we start people try to get their head around do infant and toddler and pre-K, how they look similar and how they look different. I think it's important to show kind of 2 dimensions that seem similar, early language support and language modeling, and do a little bit of compare and contrasting. And I think this also talks a little bit to the idea of one of the questions we often get is, why wasn't an infant-toddler combined tool developed? And I think one of the feedbacks I continue to get from the authors is that, development, even though it is only a 36-month gap, take one step back. So if we think about infant being used for children ages 6 weeks to 18 months, toddler being used with children in classrooms serving kids 15 months to 36 months, and there is a little bit of deliberate overlap right there. One of the things we like to think about is how are those kids similar, but how are those different? And especially when you think about language and how a teacher interacts with language and facilitates language development, it's very different when you're working with someone who is an 8-week-old or an 8-month-old and someone who's 28 months. And so I think those are some of the compare and contrast pieces that are very important, as well as we'll show why 2 separate tools were developed. And so when we think about early language support, again, we talk about kind of the teacher talk that's in the room, what the teacher is doing to initiate and to repeat sounds, and then how are they extending communication. So if this was an intro training, or if this was an observation training for those of you who are observers, what I would say is get out your score sheet or get out your piece of paper. And I'll say that to you now is just if you have a piece of paper in front of you, just take some kind of, I think about them as running record notes. And so what are you seeing that shows how the teacher is providing language in the classroom? What are you hearing that shows how the teacher is initiating conversation with those kids and repeating sounds? And then what are you seeing or hearing? Because sometimes it's seeing, right, with infants, there isn't a sound, there is just a nonverbal cue in the earliest communicative efforts. And so what are you seeing and what are you hearing that the teacher's doing to expand? And so what we're going to do is we're going to watch this video, and I'll have you just take some notes about that. We'll do the same with the toddler, and then I'll spend just a few minutes kind of comparing and contrasting, and you can do that on your own as well.
Is he sleeping? Hey, want some help? Oh, there you go. That's good. It's applesauce. Sweet and cold this morning, isn't it? It was warm yesterday, but today we took it out of the fridge. So now it's cold. Tortillas and applesauce? No. For Ethan? Yeah. He does well with that. Stephen, how's it going there? Let's put one on a spoon, and then Stephen can have a bite, and Jason, here's a bite for you. Applesauce. I know you like it.
we're doing the mute unmute piece. So now I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to compare that to. So you were really seeing lots of teacher talk, teachers using names and descriptive words and mimicking some sounds, but really most of the initiation on the part of the teacher. Some initiation kind of in response to teacher questions, but not words, but more word sounds. And again, showing most of that language was in the context of a caregiving routine. And as we know, that's where most infant classroom time is spent, in those caregiving routines. And now to contrast that, we're going to watch in a minute a toddler classroom. So a classroom with kids, somewhere, as I'm peeking at them, somewhere around 24 months, I would say. And so we, more of a teacher-directed learning, what we think about as a typical classroom learning environment. So you're going to see a teacher reading as well as conversing with a little girl around a Curious George book. And so as we think about toddler and we think about some of the language modeling, so that's the dimension we're thinking about, is that language modeling that she's doing. We're thinking about what that teacher is doing to encourage, to respond to, and to expand that child's language. So how she's using conversational language, as well as what types of opportunities is she giving for that child to use language through both questioning and conversation. And then what she's doing to repeat and extend, as well as we think of this is where toddler language modeling is different than early language support. We really begin to look at those variety of words the teacher is using, how he or she's labeling objects, and how she uses familiar language to describe unfamiliar contexts. So we're going to take a minute and watch this teacher interacting with their child.
Uh-oh. George is getting into something, isn't he? He's getting into the pancake mix.
He's got a spoon.
He got a spoon? Yeah, he forgot his spoon, didn't he? He's running away without a spoon.
Is that a big bear?
I'm saying, where is he going? I think he's where do you think he's going? You don't know? Maybe he's going to go to the store and get more pancakes. Think? Look at all these pancakes. They put syrup on it.
She can't hear you.
Yeah, he's going to hear me. When I talk, he hears me. It's a microphone. Yep.
We're gonna dance.
We're going to dance after breakfast in a little bit, okay?
On the floor?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to do the ribbon dance?
Yeah.
Yeah? And dance with your ribbon? Yeah? We'll do that a little bit after breakfast, okay? When all our friends are here. Okay? Look at George. He's making all the pancakes. Look at that. He's flipping them really, really fast. Look at that. Oh my goodness. He can make a lot of pancakes at once.
Who is that?
I don't know. It looks like a grandpa. Maybe it's the girl's grandpa. He has glasses on like me. I have glasses and he has glasses on his face.
She doesn't have glasses.
No, she doesn't have any glasses.
She has glasses.
Oh yeah, she does. She has glasses. Makes her see better.
So as I think about comparing and contrasting kind of early language support, which is kind of the language dimension for infant, with language modeling, putting these two clips with children, really somewhere between 12 and 18 months apart, it really shows how different the development is in each of these age levels. And so what the teachers are doing and how to support those teachers is uniquely different. And so when I think about, when we talked about that first teacher, she's really doing a lot of just describing of what she's doing and what the children are eating, and doing some contingency to what the communicative attempts, not words in most situations, to those children. And then when we contrast it with the toddler in the second clip, that little girl really is using conversational language, and the teacher is then providing frequent opportunities for that child to engage in back and forth. And so every time the child says something, the teacher is responding in a contingent way and helping her along the way with those communicative attempts. And also doing lots of building on the child's vocabulary. And so talking about the little girl is pointing to the microphone, and as it shows, these really are not staged; these are live clips, and so it helps that child understand what the microphone is, using the words that the child would understand. It helps, it helps him hear me. And then asking her questions about, do you want to do the ribbon dance? And not as complex as the questions as would be asked in pre-K, those really very open-ended, higher-level thinking questions, but helping the child get to another piece of information and then expanding that language. So I hope that was helpful in beginning to provide an overview of infant and toddler, and then beginning to kind of compare and contrast what those look like. So I just want to take a minute to go through kind of the resources that are available or will be available for infant and toddler. And so again, I want to take us back to this graphic because I think it's so important, because we're not just talking about measurements. We're not just talking about measuring those interactions, but we're talking about how we can support teachers learn about them and why it's important. Because I think those of you really working on state systems and local systems, it's oftentimes measurement is a gotcha, but it's when teachers understand the reason why. And so the reason why we're focusing on teacher-child interactions is because they're the things that really matter in development. They're the things that drive outcomes. They're also the things that teachers are already doing that we're trying to get them to do with more frequency, with more consistency, and more depth. And so it's putting language to what they're doing, but by providing an introduction about what those things are, it helps them. And then by providing support on the other side about how to improve them, it allows them to do those with more frequency. And so when we think about the learn piece, we think about using things like dimensions guides. And so dimensions guides are available. They're kind of a 30-page document for toddler, will be smaller for infant, that really provide just an overview of what those dimensions are as well as some strategies. And then also providing an introduction to the class, either a face-to-face introduction to the class or an online introduction to the class. And so right now, online and face-to-face introductions are available for toddler, and then those will roll out in 2014 or 2015 with infant. The other piece I'm going to pause, I want to make a comment just on the measure piece, is that in October, I guess it's this month, at the beginning of October, we released Toddler Train the Trainer, and what that allows individuals to do is individuals who are trained, reliable toddler observers can go to a toddler TTT, and they then obtain the materials and the skills they need to provide local observation trainings and introduction to the class trainings in toddler. And so we had one in Alexandria, Virginia. So there were people from Texas and Arizona, I believe Minnesota. I apologize if you're on the phone and I forgot where you're from, who were our initial people trained. And then we will have another one, I believe, in Orlando in January. And so one of the things, really thinking about capacity building. So the toddler, and there's in our blog, which is on our homepage, the tab to the right, Mary Margaret Gardner, I believe, actually I apologize, Emily Doyle did a blog post about the toddler TTT. And then on the improve piece, as I said, always important to partner, learn with measure, with improve, is the professional development piece. And so for toddler, we have MTP video library, looking at classrooms available for toddler, and then as we roll out infant, those pieces will be available in 2015.
All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I know we have a lot of questions for you, so I want to get started on those right away. As a reminder, you can submit your questions anytime that we're talking in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can with the time we have left. And if you have any questions after the webinar, please contact Rebecca. We'll leave her contact information up during the Q&A session to make sure you have time to jot it down.
So this is always something I use as a learning opportunity. So I often get the question, both in the pre-K as well, so sorry, you can't see the question, it's what are the national average scores for infants and toddlers? And so one of the things I would say is because there is not a national database, having national scores is not something that is obtainable at this point. So what we have are research scores, pre-K our national representative, and then kind of on the toddler and infant range, we have scores that are the average ranges for those measures. And so those are on the slides, and the slides will be posted along with the webinar. But there are no quote national averages at this time because we don't have a national data set. One of the things we're working with, Washington State, Miami, Florida, and Virginia, the state of Virginia, are all using Toddler currently in their to pause for a second, within their QRIS systems or rolling it out and have been collecting data for over a year. And so one of the things we're working with them is to look at what their samples are looking at. So what we have are those initial numbers that I shared with you. I think another question you had that we had were to list the indicators. A couple of people asked about the indicators for infant. And I can take a minute to do that if you want to get your papers ready. And as we share additional pieces on infant, those will be available. So under Relational Climate, it's relational behaviors, emotion expression, respect for infant state, and lack of adult negativity. And then for teacher sensitivity, it's awareness and cue detection, responsiveness, and infant's comfort. And then for facilitated exploration, it's involvement, infant-centered, and expansion of infants' experiences. And then for early language support, it's teacher talk, communication support, and communication extension. And again, so as I said, this is meant to be a kind of an initial introduction to infant. We'll be sharing additional, we're presenting at 0 to 3 in San Antonio in December, and as we get closer, we'll be sharing additional information about infant. The manual will be published by Brooks, and we'll follow that same kind of face page as well as those very deep descriptions of what a low, a mid, and a high would look like for each of the dimensions. There's a question, and I know we are going over, so I apologize. People can never keep me from talking, right, Keely? So the age range, again, for infants, the infant tool is 6 weeks to 18 months. And then there's some deliberate crossover with toddler, and that's 15 months to 36 months. And just a note on that, one of the recommendations, and there'll be additional implementation recommendations as we kind of move forward, but as with multi-age pre-K classrooms or early childhood classrooms, what we are saying is use the tool that represents the majority of the children in the classroom. And just a note on that, I believe last month, Jenny Vitellio, our research director, did a webinar on family child care centers, and that should be available on the web. And she's also written a white paper, and that will be out at the end of November. It'll be published on our web page. And that also has some initial suggestions on how to look at these multi-age classrooms that we know people are expecting. And so the question kind of on that mixed age, and is kind of how do I make that determination? And so really making the determination on the majority of the children in the classroom, as well as spent some time in Arizona a few months ago and making a statewide determination, kind of knowing the range of the classrooms that you're facing. And this is one of the questions I have for you, if anyone's interested in sharing on the survey or emailing me. One of the things as we are developing our training and our professional development around infant, one of the things we have found is because we don't have a national education system, classrooms look different across the country, even within a state. So some places have very distinct infant classrooms, some have multi-age, Early Head Start has multi-age, birth through 3. And so one of the things we are really looking at and are interested in talking to people from across the country is both what do your infant settings and toddler settings look like within your community, as well as how do you provide support for those teachers, and how do you provide trainings for those people who support the teachers, and that will help us better understand how to target some of our training and professional development. So with that, I think we're a couple minutes over. We will look through all these questions and we can respond to them. If you have any additional questions, my contact information is up on this web page. Our next webinar, as Keely said, is the feedback webinar in December, and Hillary Ritt will be providing that. A couple other pieces of information, as I mentioned, our new interactions video is on our website. Our toddler TTT is available now for those of you who are interested in becoming a toddler trainer, either having a trainer come locally to train a group or at regional trainings. And our regional training calendar for 2014 should be up on our website for trainings that are January 2014 through the end of the year. And we've also, it's a busy time at Teachstone, we've also just released an instructional support strategies face-to-face training that we're doing both locally as well as at the regional. So lots of things to find on our website. The other exciting thing is my blog. Teachstone has about a month ago initiated a blog that is being provided to you by people like myself and some of our trainers and some of our MTP staff and our content staff on everything from questions people have about coaching, questions they have about dimension. I'm doing kind of a federal review, and so for those of you who follow our blog, about 2 weeks ago I posted about the shutdown and likening to the Everything I Learned in Kindergarten poem, and then today I just released my blog post for what we're going to do after the shutdown and next steps that we need to take. So it was wonderful spending an hour with you this afternoon. As Keely said, this will be posted on the Teachstone website, but you have my contact information if you have any questions, and like us on Facebook, and you can connect to me on LinkedIn as well. I have a LinkedIn account. Anything else, Keely, before we finish?
I think that about covers it, Rebecca. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for joining us today and for participating, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.